After living 20 years in chains, the bear was freed, but her reaction shocked everyone. In the remote wilderness of Montana, where the majestic Rockies cast long shadows across forgotten valleys, Sarah Thompson had dedicated her life to wildlife rescue. But nothing in her 20 years of experience could have prepared her for what she discovered on that crisp autumn morning at the abandoned Miller's Ranch. The tip had come from a local hunter who'd glimpsed something unusual while tracking deer in the area. What Sarah found made her heart sink. A female grizzly bear chained in a makeshift enclosure behind a dilapidated barn. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us from which city you are watching us. We continue. The bear's condition spoke of years of neglect. The chain around her neck had become embedded in her flesh, creating a permanent collar of scar tissue. The space where she was kept barely allowed her to turn around, and the metal roof above had rusted through in places, letting in thin strips of sunlight that seemed to mock the concept of freedom. This wasn't just a case of animal neglect. It was a testament to human cruelty that made Sarah's blood run cold. "How long has she been here?" Sarah whispered to Mike Reynolds, her colleague from the Montana Wildlife Sanctuary. The question hung in the air like morning frost, but they both knew the answer wouldn't come easy. The property had changed hands several times over the past 2 decades, with each owner claiming ignorance about the bear's existence. The bear's eyes were what haunted Sarah the most. They weren't the eyes of a wild animal. They were vacant, almost ghost-like, as if the spirit within had retreated so far inside that it might never find its way back. When Sarah approached the enclosure, the bear didn't even lift her head. There was no sign of aggression, no defensive posturing, just an eerie stillness that spoke of something far worse than physical chains. Getting the necessary permits to rescue the bear took weeks of bureaucratic wrestling. Sarah spent countless hours on the phone, filled out mountains of paperwork, and called in every favor she had accumulated over her career. The whole time, she couldn't shake the image of those empty eyes from her mind. She named the bear Grace, though she wasn't sure why, perhaps because it was what the animal had been denied for so long. When the day of the rescue finally arrived, Sarah assembled a team of the best wildlife veterinarians and handlers in the state. Dr. Emily Curtis, a leading expert in rehabilitating captive bears, flew in from Wyoming to oversee the operation. The team arrived at dawn, equipped with tranquilizers they hoped they wouldn't need, and cutting tools for the chains. The removal of the chains proved more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Years of exposure had caused the metal to rust and fuse with the bear's collar of scar tissue. Dr. Curtis worked meticulously, careful not to cause any additional trauma. What shocked everyone wasn't the bear's resistance. It was her complete lack of response. She remained motionless throughout the entire procedure, as if she didn't realize that change was possible. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Curtis admitted quietly to Sarah. "It's as if she's forgotten she's a bear at all." The transport to the Montana Wildlife Sanctuary was carefully orchestrated, but Grace refused to move from her spot even after the chains were removed. The team had to coax her with food, speaking in soft voices, trying to awaken some spark of natural instinct. It took hours to get her into the transport cage, and even then, she moved as if invisible chains still bound her. At the sanctuary, they had prepared a spacious enclosure with natural features: trees, rocks, a small pond, and plenty of places to forage and explore. But when they released Grace into her new home, she simply stood in one spot, swaying slightly as if unable to comprehend the concept of space. She wouldn't even approach the food left for her, despite it being the finest selection of fresh fish and berries. Sarah stayed with Grace long after the rest of the team had left for the day. As darkness fell over the sanctuary, she watched the bear through the observation window, her heart heavy with the realization that physical freedom might not be enough. The real challenge wasn't removing the chains, it was helping Grace remember who she was meant to be. What Sarah didn't know then was that hope would arrive in an unexpected form, and Grace's journey back to herself would become one of the most remarkable stories of resilience she had ever witnessed. As she drove home that night, the headlights cutting through the Montana darkness, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something extraordinary. 2 weeks had passed since Grace's arrival at the Montana Wildlife Sanctuary, and Sarah Thompson was growing increasingly concerned. Despite their best efforts, the bear showed no signs of improvement. She remained in the same corner of her enclosure, barely touching the food provided, her eyes fixed on the ground, as if the chains that had bound her for so long were still there, invisible but unrelenting. Dr. Emily Curtis had stayed on at the sanctuary, intrigued and troubled by Grace's case. "The physical wounds are healing," she told Sarah one morning as they observed the bear from the monitoring station. "But the psychological trauma runs deeper than we initially thought. It's as if she's still living in that tiny space, unable to comprehend that she's free." The sanctuary staff had tried various enrichment techniques, scattered food to encourage foraging, introduced new scents, and even played recordings of forest sounds. But Grace remained unmoved, her massive frame a statue of resignation. She would only eat when the food was placed directly in front of her, and even then, her movements were mechanical, devoid of any natural bear behavior. "There has to be something we haven't tried," Sarah muttered, more to herself than to Emily. She had taken to spending her evenings at the observation post, watching Grace long after her shifts ended. Sometimes in the quiet of twilight, she thought she saw small changes, a slight turn of the head, a momentary focus on a passing bird. But these glimpses of awareness were fleeting, like stars disappearing behind clouds. Then came the call that would change everything. Jason Miller, a ranger from Yellowstone National Park, contacted the sanctuary about another rescue operation. "We've got a male grizzly," he explained over the phone. "Been kept in similar conditions to your Grace, but this one's different. He's showing more spirit despite his circumstances." Sarah and Emily exchanged glances as they listened to Jason's report. The bear had been discovered in an abandoned private zoo in Idaho, chained but still displaying natural behaviors, attempting to forage despite his restrictions, responding to environmental stimuli, and even trying to break free from his constraints. "We're calling him Spirit," Jason continued, "because despite everything, he hasn't lost his." The decision to bring Spirit to the sanctuary wasn't made lightly. Introducing a new bear, especially a male, required careful consideration. But something about this situation felt right to Sarah. She couldn't explain it, but her instincts, honed by years of working with rescued wildlife, told her this could be the catalyst Grace needed. The day Spirit arrived, the atmosphere at the sanctuary crackled with nervous energy. The transport truck kicked up dust as it wound its way up the sanctuary's access road, and Sarah could hear the occasional grunt from within, signs of life that were so absent in Grace's arrival. Unlike Grace, Spirit was alert during his transfer to the rehabilitation enclosure adjacent to Grace's. His eyes tracked the movements of the staff, and while he showed no aggression, there was an unmistakable presence about him. He explored his new space immediately, testing the boundaries, sniffing the air, and investigating every feature of his enclosure. "Look at that," Emily whispered, pointing to something remarkable. Grace, for the first time in weeks, had lifted her head. Through the reinforced glass barrier that separated the enclosures, she was watching Spirit's movements with what appeared to be curiosity. Sarah held her breath, afraid that any sudden movement or sound might break the spell. Spirit had approached the water feature in his enclosure, pawing at the surface and creating ripples that caught the afternoon light. Grace's eyes followed each splash, each movement, as if witnessing something she had forgotten existed. That evening, as the sanctuary grew quiet and the Montana sky painted itself in shades of purple and gold, Sarah stayed behind to observe. Through the night vision cameras, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. The staff had positioned the cameras to monitor both bears, split-screen displays showing their respective enclosures. What Sarah witnessed in those quiet hours would forever change her understanding of healing. As darkness settled over the sanctuary, Grace did something she hadn't done since her arrival. She moved from her corner. It was a small movement, barely noticeable at first, but in the context of weeks of immobility, it was monumental. The cameras captured every detail. Grace taking 3 tentative steps toward the barrier that separated her from Spirit, her head slightly raised, nostrils flaring as she caught his scent. On the other side, Spirit had settled near the barrier, his presence somehow both powerful and gentle. Sarah watched, tears welling in her eyes, as Grace's first real step toward. Recovery played out on the monitors before her. It wasn't just about physical movement, it was about connection, about recognizing something familiar in another being who understood her pain. As the night deepened, Sarah realized she was witnessing not just a moment, but the beginning of a journey that would redefine everything they thought they knew about healing. Dawn broke over the Montana Wildlife Sanctuary, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. Sarah Thompson arrived earlier than usual, eager to see if Grace's nighttime movement had led to any lasting changes. As she approached the observation area, Dr. Emily Curtis was already there, her face pressed close to the glass, watching intently. "She moved again," Emily whispered, not taking her eyes off the enclosure. Just before sunrise, she's about 6 feet from her usual spot. Sarah's heart quickened as she observed Grace's new position. The bear was still maintaining her characteristic stillness, but the change in location was undeniable. More significantly, she was oriented toward Spirit's enclosure, her head slightly raised, as if listening to something only she could hear. Spirit, for his part, had established a morning routine that seemed deliberately designed to capture attention. He would start at the water feature, splashing and playing with a natural enthusiasm that seemed almost exaggerated. Then, he would move to the fallen logs in his enclosure, using them as scratching posts, his movements fluid and purposeful. "He knows she's watching," Emily observed, making notes in her journal. "Look at how he positions himself. He's always in her line of sight." The sanctuary staff had begun documenting every minute detail of the bear's interactions, even though they were separated by the reinforced barrier. They noted how Spirit would pause in his activities whenever Grace showed any sign of movement, how he would orient his body toward her enclosure, creating what Emily called a dialogue of presence. As the morning progressed, the team witnessed something extraordinary. Spirit approached the barrier with a branch he had pulled from one of the enrichment trees in his enclosure. Instead of playing with it himself, he dropped it near the barrier and took a few steps back, as if extending an invitation. Grace's response was subtle but unmistakable. Her eyes tracked the branch's movement, and for a brief moment, her nose twitched, the first sign of active interest in her environment that anyone had observed. Sarah and Emily exchanged glances, hardly daring to breathe. "This is remarkable," Emily whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She's not just observing anymore. She's responding." The breakthrough, when it came, was both beautiful and heartbreaking. As Spirit continued his display with the branch, Grace slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, extended one paw forward. The movement was tentative, almost childlike in its uncertainty, but it carried the weight of 20 years of chains being shed, one link at a time. Throughout the day, the sanctuary staff watched as Grace began to explore her own space in tiny increments. Each movement was cautious, as if she was relearning how to exist in a world without boundaries. She would take a few steps, then freeze, her body tense with uncertainty. But inevitably, her eyes would find Spirit, and something in his confident movement seemed to reassure her. As evening approached, Sarah made a decision that went against standard protocol, but felt instinctively right. With Emily's support, they adjusted the feeding schedule, placing Grace and Spirit's evening meals at the same time, in locations where they could see each other eating. If she can see him engaging with food naturally, it might help awaken her own instincts, Sarah explained to the team. The experiment yielded immediate results. For the first time since her arrival, Grace approached her food without prompting. Her movements were still hesitant, but as she watched Spirit tear into his meal with natural enthusiasm, she began to display small signs of normal feeding behavior. But it was what happened after dinner that truly amazed the observers. As the light faded and the sanctuary grew quiet, Spirit settled near the barrier, his massive form relaxed and at ease. Grace, in a move that brought tears to Sarah's eyes, shifted her resting position to mirror his, maintaining a few feet of distance, but clearly choosing to be closer to him. "Look at her eyes," Emily noted, reviewing the footage later that night. The vacant stare that had haunted Sarah since Grace's rescue was showing subtle changes. There were moments when a spark of something, curiosity perhaps, or recognition, would flicker across her gaze. Sarah stayed late again that night, unable to tear herself away from the unfolding story before her. As she watched the two bears in the gathering darkness, she realized that Spirit wasn't just showing Grace how to be a bear again. He was showing her how to be alive. Every movement, every natural behavior he displayed was like a key unlocking doors that had been closed for decades. In the quiet of the observation room, Sarah began to formulate a new rehabilitation plan. If Spirit's presence could evoke such changes in just 2 days, what might be possible with a carefully structured program of parallel activities? She began sketching out ideas, her mind racing with possibilities, unaware that the most remarkable developments were yet to come and that Grace's journey back to herself was about to take an unexpected turn. The Montana spring brought with it a transformation that seemed to mirror Grace's slowly awakening spirit. As the snow began to melt and the first green shoots pushed through the soil, Sarah Thompson noticed subtle but significant changes in the female bear's behavior. Each day brought new signs of life, small victories that the sanctuary staff celebrated. With quiet joy, Dr. Emily Curtis had developed a detailed documentation system to track Grace's progress. "It's the little things," she explained to her team during their morning briefing. "The way she's beginning to track the movement of birds overhead, how she's starting to investigate different scents in her enclosure. These are all signs that her natural instincts are gradually reawakening." Spirit's presence continued to be the catalyst for these changes. His natural behaviors served as a constant reminder of what it meant to be a bear, and Grace watched his every move with increasing attention. The male bear had developed what seemed to be an intentional routine, performing natural behaviors near the barrier between their enclosures, as if providing daily lessons in being wild. One particularly memorable morning, Spirit discovered a honey-filled enrichment log that the staff had placed in his enclosure. Instead of immediately claiming the treat, he approached it with exaggerated movements, batting at it playfully and making soft vocalizations that carried across to Grace's enclosure. His performance drew Grace's attention immediately. Sarah, watching from the observation post, held her breath as Grace lifted herself from her resting spot and took several deliberate steps toward the barrier. It was the most purposeful movement they had seen from her yet. "She's not just following him now," Sarah whispered to Emily. "She's choosing to investigate." The sanctuary staff had begun placing similar enrichment items in Grace's enclosure, mirroring the positions of those in Spirit's space. For weeks, she had ignored them, but today was different. As Spirit enjoyed his honey-filled log, Grace approached her own enrichment item. Her movements were still hesitant, but there was a new quality to them, a glimmer of the natural curiosity that had been suppressed for so long. The breakthrough came when Grace actually touched the log with her paw. The motion was awkward, unpracticed, but it was intentional. Spirit paused in his own exploration, his attention focused entirely on Grace. The connection between the two bears had grown stronger with each passing day, creating what Emily called a silent dialogue of healing. As spring progressed, Sarah and her team implemented more sophisticated rehabilitation techniques. They introduced new scents and textures to both enclosures, created puzzle feeders that required problem-solving skills, and even installed shallow pools filled with live fish. Spirit tackled each new challenge with enthusiasm, while Grace watched and, increasingly, began to imitate his behaviors. The most touching moments often came during the quiet times between activities. Spirit had developed a habit of resting near the barrier, and Grace would position herself nearby, close enough to sense his presence, but far enough to maintain her comfort zone. During these peaceful interludes, the staff observed subtle forms of communication between the bears, slight shifts in position, gentle huffs, and moments of shared stillness that spoke of growing trust. One afternoon, as storm clouds gathered over the sanctuary, Sarah witnessed an interaction that brought tears to her eyes. A loud thunderclap startled Grace, causing her to retreat toward her old corner. But before she could fully withdraw, Spirit moved closer to the barrier, making soft, reassuring sounds. To everyone's amazement, Grace paused, then slowly turned back, choosing to stay near Spirit rather than return to her familiar place of refuge. "This is more than just imitation now," Emily observed, making notes in her journal. "She's developing trust, not just in Spirit, but in her own ability to handle new experiences." The sanctuary's nighttime cameras captured increasingly frequent moments of activity from Grace. She had begun to explore her enclosure under the cover of darkness, when the sanctuary was quiet and still. The footage showed her investigating areas she had previously avoided, touching trees, rocks, and even occasionally batting at the enrichment toys left by the staff. Sarah spent hours reviewing the nighttime footage, noting every new behavior, every small sign of progress. "Look at this," she said to Emily one morning, pointing to a particular sequence. Grace had discovered a patch of fresh grass in her enclosure and was touching it tentatively with her paw, then her nose, in a display of natural investigative behavior that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. The transformation was far from complete. Grace still had moments of withdrawal, times when the weight of her past seemed to press heavily upon her. But these episodes were becoming shorter, less frequent, and most importantly, she was beginning to find her way back from them on her own. As Sarah watched the two bears that evening, she reflected on the power of connection. Spirit hadn't just shown Grace how to be a bear again. He had shown her that change was possible, that the world could be more than the tiny space she had known for so long. And while there were still challenges ahead, Sarah knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, the rebuilding of a life that everyone else had thought was beyond saving. The Montana Wildlife Sanctuary was coming alive with the full flush of spring. Wildflowers dotted the surrounding meadows, and the air was filled with the sounds of returning birds. For Sarah Thompson, these changes in the natural world seemed to parallel Grace's continuing transformation. Each day brought new signs of progress, small but significant steps toward recovery that filled the sanctuary staff with cautious optimism. Dr. Emily Curtis had begun implementing more ambitious rehabilitation protocols. "We need to start introducing Grace to more complex natural environments," she explained during a staff meeting. "She's showing readiness for new challenges, and Spirit's presence has been invaluable in helping her navigate these experiences." The team had noticed that Grace was becoming more responsive to the natural rhythms of the day. She would stir at dawn when the birds began their morning songs, show increased activity during feeding times, and even display interest in the afternoon sun patches that moved across her enclosure. These were behaviors that Spirit had exhibited from the start, but now Grace was developing her own daily patterns. One particularly promising development came when the sanctuary staff introduced new vegetation into both enclosures. Spirit, true to form, immediately began investigating the fresh plants, using his powerful sense of smell to explore them. Grace, who would have ignored such changes just weeks before, now watched his investigation with evident interest. Then, in a moment that had the observation team holding their breath, she approached her own patch of vegetation and began to mimic his exploratory behavior. "She's not just copying him anymore," Emily noted, her voice filled with excitement. "She's beginning to remember. These are natural bear behaviors that were suppressed for decades, but they're still there, just waiting to be awakened." Sarah had been developing plans for the next phase of Grace's rehabilitation. The sanctuary included a series of progressively more natural enclosures, including one with a flowing stream that mimicked the rivers of the Montana wilderness. But introducing Grace to moving water would be a delicate process. For a bear who had spent 20 years in a tiny space, the sight and sound of a rushing stream could be overwhelming. Spirit, as if sensing the importance of his role, had begun displaying more water-related behaviors. He would play in his drinking pool, creating splashes that caught Grace's attention. The staff had noticed how she would watch these displays with increasing interest, occasionally approaching her own water source with newfound curiosity. "We need to proceed carefully," Sarah advised her team. "Each new experience needs to feel safe and manageable for Grace. Spirit's presence has been crucial in helping her feel secure enough to explore, but we can't rush this process." The breakthrough came during an unexpected spring shower. As the rain began to fall, Spirit displayed his usual enthusiasm for water, playing in the puddles that formed in his enclosure. Grace, instead of retreating to her sheltered area as she had done in the past, remained in the open, lifting her face to feel the raindrops. It was a moment of pure, natural connection that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Encouraged by this response, the sanctuary team began preparing for the next crucial step in Grace's rehabilitation. They installed a small, shallow pool in her enclosure, similar to the one Spirit had been using. The installation was done gradually over several days, allowing Grace to observe each change without feeling overwhelmed. Spirit seemed to understand the significance of this new addition. He increased his water play activities, making sure Grace could see how he interacted with his pool. His demonstrations were almost methodical, showing how to approach the water, how to test it with a pour, how to enjoy its cooling effects on a warm spring day. The night vision cameras captured Grace's first independent exploration of her new pool. Under the cover of darkness, when the sanctuary was quiet, she approached the water with careful steps. Her reflection in the still surface caught her attention, and for several long moments she stood motionless, studying the image before her. It was perhaps the first time in decades that she had really seen herself. What happened next was something Sarah would never forget. Grace, slowly, deliberately, touched the water with her paw, creating ripples that distorted her reflection. Instead of retreating from this change, she remained engaged, watching the water move and settle. It was a small interaction, but it represented something profound. Grace was beginning to recognize herself as a being capable of affecting her environment. As Sarah reviewed the footage with Emily the next morning, they could hardly contain their excitement. "This is more than just progress," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. "She's rediscovering herself, piece by piece. Each new experience, each natural behavior she reclaims is bringing her closer to who she was always meant to be." The success with the small pool opened new possibilities for Grace's rehabilitation. Sarah knew that the next step, introducing her to the sanctuary's river enclosure, would be challenging, but Grace was showing them every day that she was ready for more. With Spirit as her guide and her own awakening instincts leading the way, she was proving that even the deepest wounds could heal. What no one at the sanctuary realized yet was that the most profound moment of Grace's transformation was still to come, and it would happen by the flowing waters of the sanctuary's river, where a reflection would show her something she had forgotten she could be. The day that would change everything dawned clear and bright at the Montana Wildlife Sanctuary. Sarah Thompson arrived early, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Today was the day they would introduce Grace to the river enclosure, a sprawling natural habitat complete with a flowing stream fed by mountain springs. It was a crucial step in Grace's rehabilitation, one that would test how far she had truly come. Dr. Emily Curtis had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The river enclosure was designed to mimic the natural environment of Montana's wilderness, with its gentle slopes, native vegetation, and most importantly, the clear, flowing water that would provide Grace with her first experience of a natural waterway. Spirit had been moved to the adjacent section of the enclosure the day before, and his presence would be essential for what they hoped to achieve. Remember, Emily briefed the team, this isn't just about introducing her to water. This is about helping her reconnect with her true nature. The river represents something primal, something that speaks to the wild heart of every bear. The transfer process began slowly. Grace had grown more trusting of the sanctuary staff, but any major change still required patience and careful handling. They used her growing bond with Spirit to their advantage, allowing her to see him exploring and enjoying the new environment before attempting to move her. Spirit, as if understanding the importance of his role, put on an impressive display of natural bear behavior. He waded into the shallow parts of the stream, fishing with natural expertise, and showed obvious pleasure in the cool, flowing water. His activities created a symphony of splashes and movements that caught Grace's attention immediately. When they finally opened the passage to Grace's section of the river enclosure, she hesitated at the threshold. The sound of flowing water was unlike anything she had experienced in her decades of captivity. She lifted her head, nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of wet earth and fresh water. Sarah and Emily watched from the observation post, barely breathing, as Grace took her first tentative steps into the new space. The morning sun cast dappled shadows through the trees, creating a dance of light on the water's surface. Grace approached the riverbank with careful, measured steps, her eyes fixed on the moving water. Spirit had positioned himself downstream, demonstrating peaceful interaction with the environment. His presence seemed to give Grace the courage to move closer to the water's edge. When she reached the bank, something extraordinary happened. She caught sight of her reflection in a calm pool formed by a natural bend in the stream. The moment was captured perfectly by the sanctuary's cameras. Grace, standing motionless at the water's edge, seeing herself clearly perhaps for the first time since her rescue. Her reflection rippled in the gentle current, a moving image of a bear who had endured so much yet somehow survived. She tilted her head, studying the image before her with an intensity that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "Look at her eyes," Emily whispered, gripping Sarah's arm. The vacant stare that had haunted them for so long was gone, replaced by something new, a spark of recognition, a glimmer of self-awareness that had been buried beneath decades of trauma. Spirit chose that moment to create a gentle splash, sending ripples across the water that distorted both their reflections. Instead of retreating from the disruption, Grace watched the water move and settle, her attention completely focused on the changing patterns before her. Then, in a moment that would be forever etched in the memories of everyone present, she did something unprecedented, Grace lifted her paw and deliberately touched the water's surface, creating her own ripples that merged with the natural flow of the stream. The action was so natural, so bear-like, that for a moment it was easy to forget the decades of chains and confinement that had preceded this moment. What happened next exceeded everyone's expectations. Spirit moved closer, entering the shallow water with confident ease. Grace watched him, her body tense but not fearful. The male bear began to fish, his movements fluid and purposeful, demonstrating one of the most fundamental bear behaviors. The staff held their breath as Grace took another step toward the water. The cameras captured every detail: Grace's first tentative step into the stream, the way she paused as the cool water flowed around her paw, the subtle changes in her expression. As new sensations awakened long-dormant instincts, Spirit remained nearby, his presence a constant reassurance as Grace began to explore this new element. Sarah couldn't hold back her tears as she watched Grace wade deeper into the stream. "She's remembering," she whispered to Emily. "She's finally remembering who she is." The transformation wasn't just physical. It was as if something fundamental had shifted within Grace's being. The bear who had spent 20 years unable to move freely was now standing in flowing water, her reflection merging with the natural world around her. Each ripple seemed to wash away another layer of her past trauma, revealing the wild spirit that had been trapped inside for so long. As the day progressed, Grace continued to explore the water, each movement becoming more natural, more confident. Spirit remained close by, his presence a bridge between her past and the new possibilities opening before her. The river had become more than just water. It was a mirror showing Grace a truth she had forgotten. She was, and always had been, a wild being capable of healing and transformation. The days following Grace's transformative experience at the river brought changes that amazed even the most optimistic members of the sanctuary team. Sarah Thompson noticed it first, in the early morning hours. Grace was no longer waiting for Spirit to initiate activity. Instead, she would make her way to the water's edge as dawn broke, her movements carrying a new sense of purpose. Dr. Emily Curtis had modified her observation protocols to document these unprecedented changes. "It's as if the river awakened something primal in her," she explained during a team meeting. "The bear we're seeing now is dramatically different from the one who arrived at the sanctuary. She's not just mimicking Spirit anymore, she's rediscovering her own instincts." The most striking change was in Grace's eyes. The vacant stare that had haunted Sarah for so long was gone, replaced by an alertness that grew stronger with each passing day. Grace would watch the fish moving in the clear water, her head tilting slightly as she tracked their movements. Though she hadn't yet attempted to fish herself, her interest in the activity was unmistakable. Spirit seemed to sense this shift in Grace's demeanor and adjusted his behavior accordingly. Rather than merely demonstrating activities, he began to engage with her more directly. He would create splashes that would send water in her direction, not enough to startle her, but sufficient to invite interaction. To everyone's amazement, Grace started responding to these playful overtures with subtle movements of her own. "Look at this footage," Sarah said to Emily one morning, reviewing the previous night's recordings. The cameras had captured Grace, exploring the river in the quiet hours before dawn. She had ventured deeper into the water than ever before, and for a brief moment, she had dipped her head beneath the surface, a natural behavior that none of them had expected to see so soon. Sanctuary staff had begun noticing other changes as well. Grace's appetite had improved significantly, and she was showing interest in a wider variety of foods. She would watch with obvious attention as Spirit foraged among the native plants in their enclosure. And then, in her own time, she would investigate the same areas, sampling the vegetation with growing confidence. One particularly memorable afternoon, a sudden mountain shower passed over the sanctuary. In the past, Grace would have retreated to her sheltered area, but this time she remained by the river. The sight of her sitting calmly in the rain, letting The water run over her fur reminded Sarah of how far they'd come from those first desperate days of her rescue. "She's not just tolerating her environment anymore," Emily observed, making notes in her journal. "She's beginning to embrace it. Each new experience seems to unlock another piece of her natural behavior." The breakthrough came during what the staff had come to call the golden hour, that quiet time just before sunset when the light turned the river to liquid amber. Spirit had been fishing, demonstrating the patient focus that wild bears employ when hunting. Grace, who had been watching from her usual spot, suddenly moved closer to the water's edge. Her movements were different this time, deliberate, focused. Sarah and Emily, watching from the observation post, held their breath as Grace lowered her head toward the water. For several long moments, she remained absolutely still, her reflection perfect in the calm surface of a small pool. Then, with a swiftness that belied her years of confinement, she struck at the water with her paw. She missed the fish, of course. Such skills would take time to develop. But the attempt itself was revolutionary. It was the first time Grace had tried to fish, the first time she had acted on her natural hunting instincts since her rescue. The act represented more than just a failed attempt at catching prey. It was proof that somewhere deep inside, the wild bear she had once been still existed. Spirit's reaction to Grace's attempt was remarkable. He moved closer to her position, not crowding, but offering companionship, and together they stood in the shallow water as the sun set behind the Montana mountains. The moment was captured by the sanctuary's cameras. Two bears, their reflections merging in the golden water, their presence together somehow healing the wounds of the past. That evening, as Sarah reviewed the day's events with her team, she struggled to find words to describe the significance of what they had witnessed. "We're not just seeing physical healing anymore," she finally said. "We're watching Grace rediscover who she truly is, one moment at a time." The night brought another surprise. The infrared cameras showed Grace engaging in behavior they had never seen before. She was playing. In the shallow parts of the river, she would bat at the water, creating splashes and ripples, much as Spirit had done to engage her attention. But now she was doing it for her own enjoyment, discovering perhaps for the first time in decades the simple pleasure of interaction with her environment. As Sarah watched the footage, she realized that the river had become more than just a feature of Grace's rehabilitation. It had become a mirror showing her a new way of being, a connection to the wild spirit that had been suppressed for so long. Each ripple, each splash, each moment spent in the flowing water was washing away the memory of chains and confinement, revealing the true nature that had been waiting to emerge. Late spring in Montana brought longer days and warmer temperatures to the sanctuary, and with them came new developments in Grace's remarkable journey. Sarah Thompson had begun to notice patterns in Grace's behavior that would have seemed impossible just months ago. The bear, who had once been frozen in trauma, was now moving through her days with increasing purpose and awareness. Dr. Emily Curtis had developed a new observation protocol specifically to track these emerging patterns. "What we're seeing now goes beyond simple behavioral changes," she explained to her team. "Grace is developing her own daily rhythms, her own preferences, her own way of interacting with her environment. She's not just surviving anymore, she's beginning to truly live." The morning routine had become particularly fascinating to watch. Grace would emerge from her night shelter just before dawn, making her way to the river with deliberate steps. She would pause at different points along the way, investigating scents and examining plants, natural behaviors that spoke of an awakening curiosity about her world. Spirit's influence remained important, but the nature of their interaction had evolved. Rather than simply following his lead, Grace now engaged with him in more complex ways. They had developed what Emily called a dance of space, moving through their shared environment in patterns that respected each other's presence while maintaining their individual explorations. One morning, Sarah arrived at the observation post to find Emily already there, excitement evident in her expression. "Watch this," she said, pointing to the morning footage. The cameras had captured Grace engaging in behavior that none of them had seen before. She was using a fallen log as a scratching post, a natural behavior that bears use to mark territory and maintain their fur. What made it remarkable was that she had discovered this on her own, without Spirit's demonstration. "She's not just remembering how to be a bear," Sarah observed, her voice thick with emotion. "She's discovering who she is as an individual." The river continued to play a crucial role in Grace's transformation. She had developed her own relationship with the water, spending hours exploring different parts of the stream, learning its patterns and rhythms. Her fishing attempts, while still largely unsuccessful, showed increasing sophistication. She would watch the movement of fish beneath the surface with focused attention, her patience growing with each attempt. Perhaps the most touching developments came in the quiet moments between activities. Grace had begun to display what the staff called comfort behaviors, stretching out in patches of sunlight, rolling in soft grass, or simply sitting by the water's edge, watching the play of light on its surface. These were actions that served no immediate survival purpose, but spoke of a growing sense of security and well-being. One particularly memorable afternoon, a family of otters appeared in the river. In the past, such an intrusion might have caused Grace to retreat, but instead, she watched them with evident fascination. The otters played and fished in the water, their natural joy in their environment, providing an unexpected lesson in wild behavior. Spirit, who had been dozing nearby, raised his head to observe the scene. His presence seemed to give Grace the confidence to move closer to the water's edge, watching the otter's fluid movements with intense interest. For nearly an hour, both bears observed these smaller creatures, their attention completely absorbed in this natural display. "Look at her body language," Emily whispered to Sarah as they watched. "There's no tension, no fear. She's simply experiencing the moment, just as a wild bear would." The sanctuary's cameras captured another significant moment later that day. After the otters had moved on, Grace approached the spot where they had been playing. She investigated the area thoroughly, her nose working to catalog the new scents. Then, in a moment that brought tears to Sarah's eyes, Grace entered the water and began to move through it with some of the same fluid motions she had observed in the otters. "She's learning from everything around her now," Emily noted in her journal, "not just from Spirit, but from all the wild creatures that share this space. Each interaction adds another layer to her understanding of what it means to be free." The evening brought its own revelations. Grace had established a routine of settling near the water as the sun set, but now she was engaging in more complex behaviors. She would gather soft vegetation to create comfortable resting spots, another natural behavior that she had rediscovered. On her own, Spirit would often settle nearby, their comfortable proximity speaking of a deepening bond that went beyond mere companionship. As night fell over the sanctuary, the infrared cameras continued to document Grace's journey. She had begun to display more nocturnal activity, exploring her environment under the cover of darkness, as wild bears often do. Her movements had taken on a confidence that would have seemed impossible during those first difficult days of her rescue. Sarah, reviewing the footage with Emily, found herself marveling at the bear's resilience. "When we first found her, I wasn't sure if she could ever recover from what she'd endured," she admitted. "But look at her now. Every day she shows us something new, something that proves the wild spirit inside her never truly died." The transformation they were witnessing went beyond physical healing or behavioral changes. They were watching a being rediscover her essential nature, piece by piece, moment by moment. And as Grace continued to explore and grow, she was teaching them all something profound about the power of resilience and the enduring strength of the wild spirit. The Montana summer arrived in full force at the wildlife sanctuary, bringing with it new challenges and opportunities for Grace's continuing transformation. The longer days and warmer temperatures had awakened something profound in both bears, and Sarah Thompson found herself witnessing behaviors that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Dr. Emily Curtis had begun documenting what she called complexity markers, signs that Grace's behavior was becoming increasingly sophisticated and natural. "We're seeing layers of interaction now," she explained during a team meeting. "It's not just about basic survival behaviors anymore. She's developing preferences, making choices, showing curiosity about things that don't directly relate to her immediate needs." One particularly hot afternoon, the sanctuary staff watched in amazement as Grace discovered a new way to cool off. She had observed Spirit using a shallow depression in the ground, filled with rainwater, as a cooling spot. Instead of simply copying him, Grace found her own location near the river and began to dig. Her movements were purposeful, creating a small hollow that would collect water from the stream. "This is extraordinary," Sarah whispered to Emily as they watched. "She's not just imitating anymore. She's problem-solving, adapting behaviors to suit her own needs." The relationship between Grace and Spirit had evolved into something beautiful and unexpected. They had developed a way of communicating through subtle movements and vocalizations that spoke of a deep understanding. Spirit would often pause in his activities to check on Grace's location, not out of concern anymore, but as part of their natural rhythm together. One morning, the sanctuary staff arrived to find both bears engaged in what could only be described as play. Spirit had discovered a fallen tree trunk near the water, and his investigation of it had caught Grace's attention. To everyone's amazement, she approached the log and began to explore it herself, even as Spirit continued his examination. Their movements around the obstacle became almost choreographed, each bear aware of the other's presence, but confident in their own exploration. "Look at her posture," Emily noted, frantically writing in her observation journal. "There's no hesitation, no seeking approval. She's engaging with her environment on her own terms now." The cameras captured countless moments of Grace's growing independence. She had established her own territories within the enclosure, places where she would go to rest, to observe, or to engage in the increasingly complex behaviors that marked her recovery. Her movements through these spaces showed a confidence that stood in stark contrast to the fearful, withdrawn bear they had first rescued. Perhaps the most significant development came during a summer thunderstorm. In the past, loud noises had sent Grace retreating to her most sheltered spots. But this time, as lightning illuminated the Montana sky and thunder rolled across the sanctuary, she remained by the river. Spirit, nearby but not hovering, continued his own activities, providing a calm presence during the natural display. "She's not just tolerating the storm," Sarah observed, watching through the rain-streaked windows of the observation post. "She's experiencing it, just as a wild bear would." The sanctuary's night vision cameras revealed even more progress. Grace had developed a full repertoire of natural nocturnal behaviors. She would spend hours under the stars, exploring, foraging, and engaging with her environment in ways that spoke of her growing connection to her true nature. The bear, who had once been afraid to move, was now most active when the world was quiet and dark. One particularly meaningful moment came when Grace encountered a challenge that would have overwhelmed her in the past. A fallen branch had created a new obstacle in her path to the river. Instead of avoiding it or waiting for Spirit to show her what to do, she assessed the situation and found her own way around it, showing problem-solving skills that delighted the sanctuary staff. "This is what healing looks like," Emily said to Sarah as they reviewed the footage. "Not just the absence of trauma, but the presence of adaptation, of engagement, of joy in discovering what's possible." The summer days brought new enrichment, opportunities, and Grace approached each one with growing curiosity. The sanctuary staff had introduced different textures and scents to the enclosure, and Grace would spend hours investigating these new elements. Her exploration was methodical, thorough, showing an intelligence that had always been there but had been suppressed by years of confinement. Spirit's role in her life had shifted from teacher to companion, their relationship evolving into something that looked remarkably like friendship. They would often rest near each other during the heat of the day, their presence together comfortable and natural. When one would make a discovery, a new food source, an interesting scent, a comfortable resting spot, the other would investigate in their own time, their exploration of their shared world, both independent and connected. As Sarah watched, then one evening, the setting sun painting the sanctuary in shades of gold, she reflected on the journey they had witnessed. The bear who had arrived at the sanctuary, broken by years of chains and confinement, had transformed into a being of strength and grace. Every day brought new discoveries, new behaviors, new signs that the wild heart within her had not just survived, but was thriving. The night settled over the sanctuary, but through the infrared cameras, Sarah could see that Grace's day wasn't over. She had begun her evening exploration, moving through her world with confidence and purpose. The chains that had once bound her were now nothing more than a memory, replaced by the freedom of movement, the joy of discovery, and the deep connection to her true nature that no amount of confinement had been able to destroy. Late summer brought subtle changes to the Montana Wildlife Sanctuary. The days were growing shorter, and there was a hint of autumn in the early morning air. These changes seemed to awaken something new in Grace, a deeper connection to the natural rhythms that governed wild bears' lives. Sarah Thompson noticed it first, in the way Grace had begun to approach her daily activities with increased purpose and awareness. Dr. Emily Curtis had started documenting what she called anticipatory behaviors, signs that Grace was not just responding to her environment, but actively preparing for and engaging with it in increasingly sophisticated ways. She's developing an understanding of time and seasons, Emily explained to the sanctuary team. These are complex cognitive processes that we typically see in wild bears, but they're completely new for Grace. The most remarkable evidence of this development came one morning when the sanctuary staff arrived to find Grace had created several food caches around her enclosure. This was a natural behavior for wild bears preparing for the changing seasons, but one they had never expected to see from a bear who had spent most of her life in chains. She's not just living in the moment anymore, Sarah observed, watching. Grace methodically store berries and other foods in carefully selected locations. She's planning for the future. She's thinking ahead. Spirit, who had been instrumental in Grace's recovery, now watched her activities with what almost seemed like pride. Their relationship had evolved into a partnership of equals, each bear confident in their own space while maintaining their unique bond. They would often forage together, their movements synchronized but independent, each following their own instincts while staying aware of the other's presence. One particularly memorable afternoon, the sanctuary staff witnessed something extraordinary. A young eagle had landed near the river, its presence catching both bears' attention. In the past, such an event might have startled Grace, but now she showed only curious interest. She and Spirit approached the area together, investigating the spot where the eagle had been long after it had flown away. "Look at her body language," Emily whispered to Sarah as they observed. "There's no tension, no fear. She's moving with complete confidence in her own space." The river, which had played such a crucial role in Grace's transformation, had become her favorite place for what the staff called enrichment activities. She had developed her own fishing technique, different from Spirit's, but equally effective. Her success rate had improved dramatically, and she would often spend hours by the water, completely absorbed in the natural rhythm of hunting and resting. The sanctuary's cameras captured countless moments of Grace's newfound autonomy. She had established specific routes through her enclosure, places where she would stop to investigate changes in her environment, spots where she would pause to observe the world around her. Her movements were purposeful, deliberate, showing a level of engagement with her surroundings that would have seemed impossible months ago. Perhaps the most touching developments came in the quiet moments between activities. Grace had begun to display what Emily called comfort behaviors, actions that served no immediate survival purpose but indicated a deep sense of security and well-being. She would spend long periods grooming herself, arranging her resting spots just so, or simply sitting by the water, watching the play of light on its surface. "These are the behaviors of a bear who feels safe," Emily noted in her journal. "Who knows she belongs in her environment?" Be you. One evening, as a summer storm approached, the sanctuary staff witnessed something that brought tears to their eyes. Instead of seeking shelter, Grace moved to a slightly elevated spot near the river. There she sat, facing into the wind, her nose lifted to catch the changing scents that the storm brought. Spirit, nearby but not hovering, mirrored her posture, both bears fully engaged in the natural drama unfolding around them. "This is what freedom looks like," Sarah whispered to Emily as they watched. Not just physical freedom, but the freedom to be exactly who she was meant to be. The night vision cameras revealed even more progress in Grace's development. She had become more active during the evening hours, exploring her environment with the natural curiosity of a wild bear. Her movements were confident, purposeful, showing none of the hesitation that had marked her early days at the sanctuary. One particularly significant moment came when Grace discovered a new enrichment item the staff had placed in her enclosure, a hollow log filled with hidden treats. Instead of waiting for Spirit to investigate first, she approached it directly, using her claws and nose to explore the object. Her problem-solving skills had developed to the point where she could tackle new challenges with confidence and creativity. "She's not just surviving anymore," Emily observed as they reviewed the footage. "She's thriving. She's showing us what resilience truly looks like." The transformation they had witnessed went beyond physical healing or behavioral changes. They had watched a being reclaim her essential nature piece by piece, moment by moment. The bear who had arrived at the sanctuary, broken by years of confinement, had become a testament to the enduring strength of the wild spirit. As the summer days began to shorten, Grace's activities took on a new purposefulness. She seemed to sense the changing of the seasons, her behavior adapting to the subtle shifts in temperature and daylight. Her food caches grew more numerous, her exploration more thorough, her engagement with her environment more complex. Sarah, watching Grace move through her world with such confidence and grace, reflected on the journey they had witnessed. The chains that had once bound her had left no trace on her spirit. In their place was freedom, not just the freedom of movement, but the deeper freedom of being truly, completely herself. The early signs of autumn had begun to paint the Montana landscape in rich hues of gold and crimson. At the wildlife sanctuary, these changes brought new dimensions to Grace's remarkable journey. Sarah Thompson stood at the observation post, watching as Grace moved through her morning routine with a confidence that still amazed everyone who had known her story. Dr. Emily Curtis had begun preparing a comprehensive report on Grace's rehabilitation for the international wildlife community. "What we've witnessed here goes beyond anything documented in similar cases," she explained to her colleagues. "Grace hasn't just recovered, she's become a testament to the resilience of wild spirits." The transformation was evident in every aspect of Grace's behavior. The bear, who had once been frozen in trauma, now moved through her world with purpose and joy. Her daily routines had become complex and self-directed, showing a level of engagement with her environment that spoke of complete rehabilitation. One crisp morning, The sanctuary staff arrived to find Grace had created an elaborate series of daybeds around her enclosure, each carefully positioned to catch the warmth of the sun as it moved across the sky. This kind of sophisticated environmental awareness was something they typically only saw in bears who had grown up in the wild. "She's not just using her space," Sarah observed to Emily. "She's mastering it. She understands every aspect of her environment and how to make the most of it." Spirit, who had been such a crucial part of Grace's recovery, now interacted with her as a true equal. Their relationship had evolved into something that the sanctuary staff found profoundly moving. Two beings who had overcome tremendous adversity, now sharing their world with natural ease and mutual respect. The river remained central to Grace's daily life, but her relationship with it had deepened beyond simple interaction. She had developed an almost intuitive understanding of its patterns and rhythms. The sanctuary's cameras captured her fishing with remarkable skill, her success rate now matching that of bears who had never known captivity. "Watch this," Emily said one morning, showing Sarah footage from the previous night. The video showed Grace teaching herself a new fishing technique, one that neither Spirit nor any other bear had shown her. She had discovered that by positioning herself in a particular spot where the current created a natural pool, she could catch fish with minimal effort. "This is innovation," Emily explained, her voice filled with excitement. "She's not just remembering or copying anymore, she's creating new solutions, adapting to her environment in unique ways." The sanctuary had begun receiving visits from wildlife rehabilitation experts from around the world, all eager to learn from Grace's case. Her story had become a symbol of hope, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal under the right circumstances. One afternoon, as a group of visiting experts observed from the viewing area, Grace provided a display that left them speechless. She spent hours engaged in natural bear behaviors, foraging, fishing, scent marking, and interacting with her environment in ways that showed complete comfort and confidence. "If I hadn't known her history," one visitor remarked, "I would never have guessed this bear had spent 20 years in chains. She moves like she's never known anything but freedom." The night vision cameras continued to document Grace's activities after dark, revealing behaviors that spoke of her deep connection to her natural rhythms. She would often spend the quiet hours exploring, playing in the water, or engaging in what Emily called joy behaviors, activities that served no survival purpose, but showed pure enjoyment of life. Sarah found herself particularly moved by one sequence captured during a full moon. Grace had spent nearly an hour sitting by the river, her face lifted to the night sky, completely at peace in her world. Spirit lay nearby, their comfortable proximity speaking of the deep bond they shared. "This is what healing looks like," Emily noted in her journal. "Not just the absence of trauma, but the presence of joy, of purpose, of connection to life itself." As autumn approached, Grace's behavior showed she was fully in tune with the changing seasons. She had begun preparing for the cooler weather, increasing her food intake and creating more elaborate caches around her enclosure. Her actions were purposeful and methodical, showing an understanding of natural cycles that had somehow survived her years of confinement. The sanctuary staff had started using Grace's story in their educational programs, sharing her journey with school groups and conservation organizations. Her transformation had become a powerful testimony to the importance of wildlife rehabilitation and the need to protect animals from exploitation. "What Grace has shown us," Sarah explained to a group of students, "is that the wild spirit can survive almost anything. Given the right support and environment, healing is always possible." One particularly meaningful moment came when Grace encountered something that would have terrified her in the past. A low-flying helicopter passed over the sanctuary, its rotors creating a thunderous noise. Instead of panicking, Grace simply lifted her head, assessed the situation, and returned to her activities. Her response was exactly what they would expect from a wild bear: alert, but not afraid. Complete rehabilitation isn't just about physical recovery, Emily explained. During a staff meeting, it's about reclaiming the ability to respond naturally to the world around you. Grace has done more than recover. She's rediscovered who she truly is. As the days grew shorter and the air turned crisp, Grace's story had become more than just a rehabilitation success. She had become a symbol of transformation, proving that even after decades of confinement, the wild heart could find its way back to freedom. Each day brought new evidence of her complete return to her true nature, her movements flowing with the natural grace of a being fully at home in her world. As autumn settled fully over the Montana Wildlife Sanctuary, the transformation of Grace had become more than just a rehabilitation success story. It had evolved into a testament to the enduring power of the wild spirit. Sarah Thompson stood at her familiar spot in the observation post, watching as Grace moved through her domain with a confidence that made it hard to believe she had ever known chains. Dr. Emily Curtis had finished compiling her comprehensive report on Grace's journey, documenting every step of what had become one of the most remarkable wildlife rehabilitation cases in recent history. "What we've witnessed here," she wrote in her conclusion, "challenges everything we thought we knew about the limits of recovery from severe trauma." The sanctuary had changed too, adapted to accommodate the lessons learned from Grace's rehabilitation. New protocols had been established based on the understanding that healing required more than just physical freedom. It needed the right combination of space, companionship, and patient support. One crisp morning, as the first frost painted the ground white, the sanctuary staff gathered to watch something remarkable. Grace had developed a morning ritual that seemed to encompass everything she had learned during her journey. She would start at the river, where her transformation had truly begun, moving through a series of behaviors that showed complete mastery of her environment. "Look at how she moves," Sarah whispered to Emily. "There's not a trace of her past, a trauma in her body language. She's completely present in each moment." Spirit remained a constant in Grace's life, but their relationship had evolved into something that touched everyone who witnessed it. They moved through their shared space like dance partners who knew each other's rhythms perfectly. Their interaction, a beautiful demonstration of what was possible when trauma gave way to trust. The river, which had played such a crucial role in Grace's recovery, had become more than just a feature of her habitat. She had developed an almost mystical connection with the flowing water, spending hours by its banks in what appeared to be peaceful contemplation. The sanctuary's cameras had captured countless moments of her simply sitting by the water, her expression serene, completely at peace in her world. "She's teaching us," Emily observed one evening as they watched Grace introduce herself to a new enrichment challenge. "Every day she shows us something new about resilience, about the capacity for healing, about the strength of the wild spirit." The sanctuary had begun receiving requests from wildlife rehabilitation centers around the world, all eager to learn from Grace's case. Her story had become a beacon of hope, proving that even the most severe cases of trauma could be overcome with the right approach and enough patience. One particularly touching moment came when a group of wildlife rehabilitation experts visited from different countries. As they watched Grace move through her daily activities, their professional detachment gave way to emotion. Here was living, proof that no matter how long the chains, the wild heart could find its way back to freedom. "We never expected this level of recovery," Sarah explained to the visitors. "When we first found her, she was so broken that some questioned whether rehabilitation was even possible. Now look at her. She's not just surviving, she's thriving." And The cameras continued to document Grace's activities day and night, building a remarkable record of what complete rehabilitation looked like. She had developed a full repertoire of natural behaviors, from complex foraging strategies to social interactions, from play behaviors to problem-solving skills that showed remarkable intelligence. As winter approached, Grace's behavior showed a deep attunement to the changing seasons. She had prepared multiple den sites around her enclosure, each carefully positioned and maintained. Her food caching had become more sophisticated, showing an understanding of preservation techniques that seemed to have survived her years of confinement. What we're seeing now, Emily explained during a staff meeting, is more than just learned behavior. This is innate knowledge that was always there, just waiting for the chance to express itself. The educational impact of Grace's story had grown beyond anything they had anticipated. School groups, conservation organizations, and wildlife advocates from around the world had been touched by her journey. Her transformation had become a powerful argument for animal welfare and the importance of wildlife rehabilitation. One morning, as the first snow began to fall, Sarah witnessed something that brought tears to her eyes. Grace was sitting by the river, snowflakes gathering on her fur, her expression peaceful and content. Spirit was nearby, both bears completely at ease in their world. The scene captured everything they had worked for, two beings who had overcome tremendous adversity, now living fully in the present moment, free from the shadows of their past. "This is what success looks like," Emily said softly, standing beside Sarah. "Not just physical recovery, but complete spiritual renewal. Grace has shown us that the wild spirit never truly dies. It just waits for the right moment to reawaken." As the day drew to a close, Sarah watched Grace move through her evening routine with the grace and confidence of a bear who had never known captivity. Her story had become more than just a rehabilitation success. It had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal, that freedom could be found again, no matter how long the chains. And the legacy of Grace's journey would continue to inspire and teach for years to come, touching hearts and changing minds about what was possible in wildlife rehabilitation. Her transformation from a broken, chained bear to a fully recovered wild spirit had become a testament to the resilience of nature and the power of never giving up hope. Dear listeners, we hope Grace's remarkable journey of transformation has touched your hearts as deeply as it has touched ours. Her story reminds us that healing is always possible, no matter how difficult the circumstances. To continue experiencing more inspiring stories of resilience and hope, please subscribe to our channel and click the like button below. Each story we share is carefully chosen to showcase the extraordinary power of the wild spirit and the importance of never giving up hope. Share your thoughts in the comments section. We'd love to hear how Grace's journey has impacted you. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you won't miss our next uplifting tale of transformation and healing.